So, you think medieval duels were all about honor? To noblemen, a grassy field, maybe some dramatic music in the background, a clean sword fight to settle a serious dispute, very cinematic, very chivalrous, very wrong. Because here's the truth. Medieval duels were long, bureaucratic, bloody disasters. They were less about truth and more about ego. Less about justice and more about not looking weak in front of your drunk neighbors. And they involved way more paperwork than you'd ever expect from two guys trying to kill each other with maces. This isn't a story about heroic knights defending damsels in distress. This is a story about legal systems that thought God would intervene if you hit someone hard enough. About peasants forced into holes in the ground to fight armored men on horseback. About blood, sweat, and broken ribs, all in the name of reputation. So, if you've ever wondered what it was really like to challenge someone to a duel in the Middle Ages, what it took, how it worked, and why it almost always sucked, then settle in. Because this is the slow, depressing, surprisingly administrative. Let's begin. So, you've been insulted in the year 1350. Not just a harmless joke or some harmless name-calling. No, this is serious. A man stood up in a crowded marketplace, pointed directly at you, and said something that shattered your dignity like a clay pothole of a castle wall. Maybe he accused you of theft. Maybe he mocked your lineage. Maybe he implied loudly that your wife had been seen in the company of someone else's squire. Whatever it was, it happened in public, in front of witnesses. That matters in the 14th century. That really matters, because in medieval society, your reputation isn't just a bonus. It's your currency, your protection, your survival if people think you're dishonest, cuddly, or weak. It's over. You might still own a farm. You might still wear a tunic, but socially, you're already dead. Which means this insult isn't just offensive, it's dangerous. It threatens your standing, your credibility, and possibly your entire future. And there are only a few ways to deal with it. Option 1, ignore it. Which is not really an option, because that makes you look guilty or cowardly. Option 2, petition your lord for justice and hope that he is not too busy inspecting grain taxes or crusading in the Holy Land. Option 3, and this is the one you're considering, challenge the offender to a judicial duel, a trial by combat. In other words, prove your innocence by beating the other man senseless in front of a crowd while everyone agrees that God will personally intervene to ensure the righteous man wins. And no, that's not a joke. That's how the system worked. See, medieval Europe had a lot of creative ways to figure out guilt and innocence. You could do an ordeal like holding a red-hot iron and seeing if your hand healed. Or you could swear oaths with character witnesses. But sometimes, those just weren't enough. So people turned to combatum. That's Latin for please hit each other until God makes a decision. It was considered a legitimate legal procedure, especially in places like the Holy Roman Empire, feudal France, and parts of England. And it wasn't just knights and nobles, peasants, merchants. Even widows could technically demand trial by combat, though how often they won is a different matter entirely. So what happens next? First, you go to the appropriate authority. That might be a local baron, a bailiff, or a designated court. You formally accuse your opponent of wrongdoing, usually something serious, like slander, murder, or betrayal. Something that couldn't easily be proven through witnesses or documents. You declare, under oath, that your accusation is true, and that you are willing to prove it in combat. This is known as waging the battle. It's a big deal. It involves ritual language, sometimes kneeling, sometimes invoking God, and almost always requires some form of symbolic, just like throwing down a glove. Yes, that's where the trope comes from. Then the other man is summoned. He's asked if he will accept the challenge. If he says no, it's considered an admission of guilt. If he says yes, the court accepts it as a legitimate dispute, and the duel is approved. Now, you might think that after the court says go ahead, you just grab your sword and run outside. But no, that would be uncivilized. Medieval duels were organized. They were highly regulated, slow-moving legal events. Because this wasn't just about violence, it was about maintaining the illusion of divine justice through very careful planning. So first, a field is chosen. This isn't random. It's inspected by officials to make sure it's flat, open, and fair. The duel might take place in a town square, on church land, or in a designated dueling area. It must be neutral. No terrain advantages. No hiding places. Just you, your opponent, and your weapon of choice while dozens, sometimes hundreds of people watch and occasionally place bets. Then come the preparations. The court or sometimes both parties decides what weapons will be used in most cases. You're limited to a specific set, swords, shields, axes, or wooden clubs occasionally. A court will get creative. There are documented cases where one man fought from a hole in the ground with a spear, while the other fought on horseback with a lance. Why? Because one was a nobleman and the other was a commoner. This was considered fair, seriously. You'll also have to swear additional oaths before the duel. You must declare that you are not using any form of magic, potions, charms, or enchanted undergarments. Yes, they were worried about that. Medieval people had a very real fear of sorcery and cheating. You might also be searched before the duel to ensure you aren't hiding a second dagger or a sharpened horseshoe in your boot. And then there's the armor. If allowed, it must be equal. If both of you are fighting in gambesons padded jackets, then that's it, no plate, no chainmail. If you're using shields, they must be the same size. The goal here, at least in theory, is to remove any unfair advantage and let God decide who is right. The irony, of course, is that physical strength, age, experience, and sheer dumb luck often mattered a whole lot more than divine favor. So let's pause for a moment and consider where you are now. You were insulted. You chose to defend your honor. You went to court. You filed a formal accusation. The other man accepted. The duel was approved. The field was chosen. The weapons were selected. You swore an oath. And now, you wait. Maybe you spend the next few days training with the fencing master if you can afford one. Maybe you practice alone in your backyard, swinging a stick and trying not to imagine your own skull being cracked open. Maybe you pray, or write a will, or cry, silently, in your stable. Because here is the thing about medieval duels. No matter how fair they claim to be, they're terrifying. You are going into a situation where your best-case scenario is surviving with permanent injuries. The worst-case scenario, death, in front of a crowd, with your name attached to it forever. People will tell the story. They'll say, oh yes, him. He died in a duel. Must have been guilty, or he won. But he never walked again. And even if you win, you still have to deal with the consequences. The man you beat might have family-friends, a noble patron. You might be declared innocent in the eyes of the law but hated by the community. Or fed, or resented. But for now, none of that matters. Because the insult happened. And the duel is coming. You've chosen the path of honor. And now, you have to fight. Because in the year 1350, when someone questions your integrity in public, your only real defense is to grab a sword and hope God's watching. The year was 1372, or possibly 1373. The chroniclers couldn't quite remember, and frankly, nobody cared enough to correct them. In the rolling hills of a region so forgettable it didn't even have a proper name, locals simply referred to it as that place between the slightly more interesting towns. Two men stood on the precipice of what would become the most mediocre conflict in medieval history. Sir Reginald of Blandford, a knight whose greatest achievement was once staying awake through an entire banquet, found himself embroiled in a dispute with Sir Geoffrey the mildly irritating. A man whose entire personality could be summarized as that guy who always breathes slightly too loudly during chapel. The origins of their feud were, like most things in medieval life, astonishingly mundane. It began on a Tuesday, though it might have been Wednesday, as the local priest who kept track of such things had been drinking again, when Sir Geoffrey's prize pig, a corpulent beast named Buttercup, though everyone secretly called her the devourer behind, Geoffrey's back, wandered into Sir Reginald's turnip patch. Now, these weren't just any turnips. These were Sir Reginald's special turnips, the ones he'd been nurturing with all the attention most men reserve for their firstborn sons. He'd even given them names. There was Turnip the Brave, Turnip the Less Brave, and Sir Turnipington, the latter being particularly plump and destined for greatness. Or at least a moderately flavorful stew. When Reginald discovered Buttercup mid-meal, her snout buried deep in Sir Turnipington's earthly remains, something inside him snapped. Not his patience that had been gone for years, but perhaps the last vestige of his common sense. He stormed to Geoffrey's manor, a structure that could charitably be called a fortified dwelling if one were being exceptionally generous, and demanded restitution. Geoffrey, who at that moment was engaged in the thrilling activity of watching paint dry literally, he'd commissioned a mural of himself and was supervising the artist, barely glanced up from his stool. Pigs will be pigs, he remarked with the profound wisdom of a man who had never had an original thought in his life. This dismissive response ignited a conflict that would simmer for months. Like a pot of stew left unattended by a particularly indifferent cook, Reginald began his campaign of petty revenge by accidentally letting his chickens roam onto Geoffrey's lands. These weren't ordinary chickens. They were, in Reginald's own words, specially trained, though the only thing they seemed trained to do was defecate on expensive tapestries. Geoffrey retaliated by forgetting to return a borrowed shovel, a particularly cutting blow, as it was planting season and Reginald had been looking forward to an afternoon of enthusiastic dirt poking. The feud escalated in the way only medieval grudges can, with tremendous effort expended on matters of absolutely no consequence. When both knights attended the local fair, an event that mostly consisted of a one-legged juggler and a suspicious meat pie vendor, Geoffrey made a show of purchasing the last honeyed almond from a vendor just as Reginald reached for it. Reginald responded by loudly declaring that Geoffrey's heraldic colors, a particularly bilious shade of yellow, made him look like a man who had been sick upon himself. This was, in the world of medieval insults, roughly equivalent to declaring all-out war. Matters came to a head during the annual Harvest Festival, an event normally marked by merriment, dancing, and at least one case of alcohol-induced poor decision-making. As the village bard droned through what felt like his 47th verse about a maiden who may or may not have been a goat in disguise, the lyrics were unclear. Geoffrey made his move. He leaned over to Reginald and uttered the words that would echo through history. "Your wife's embroidery is adequate." The gasp from nearby nobles could have powered a small windmill. Reginald's face turned a shade of red previously unknown to science. In that moment, surrounded by half-drunk peasants and a bard who was now weeping openly about the goat maiden's tragic fate. Reginald did what any self-respecting medieval noble would do. He challenged Geoffrey to a duel. The terms were set with all the solemnity the occasion deserved, which is to say, none at all. They would meet at dawn in 3 days' time, or possibly mid-morning, depending on how late Geoffrey slept in. The weapons would be swords, assuming neither of them misplaced theirs, which was far from guaranteed. Because, officially, it was about honor. Unofficially, it was about turnips, poultry-based vandalism, and the world's most backhanded compliment about needlework. And so, with all the fanfare of a damp squib, the stage was set for what history would remember as that time two grown men almost got hurt over a vegetable. As word of the impending duel spread through the countryside, the general reaction ranged from mild curiosity to outright disappointment. The local blacksmith, when informed he might need to prepare armor repairs, sighed deeply and began mentally calculating how much he could charge for such pointless labor. The village priest started drafting two versions of his next sermon, one about the sanctity of life, and another about how sometimes God lets stupid things happen to teach us lessons, the second one being significantly longer. Even Buttercup the pig seemed vaguely aware that something was afoot, though her primary concern remained finding her next meal. In the days leading up to the duel, both knights engaged in what they generously called training. Reginald swung his sword at a practice dummy for approximately 7 minutes before declaring himself battle-ready and retiring to a nap. Geoffrey, ever the pragmatist, paid a passing mercenary to chickens to tell him which end of the sword was the pointy one. Their respective squires, two long-suffering teenagers who had signed up for glory and found only drudgery, exchanged looks that spoke volumes about the intelligence of their employers. The night before the duel, as a light rain began to fall, because of course it did, both knights retired to their respective dwellings to contemplate mortality, honor, and whether they'd left the oven on. Reginald penned a dramatic letter to his wife, full of lofty phrases about sacrifice and legacy, then promptly forgot to send it. Geoffrey ate an entire wheel of cheese and wondered if he should have taken that offer to join the monastery when he had the chance. And so, as the moon cast its pale light over a world that remained stubbornly indifferent to their impending clash, two men prepared to fight for the most medieval of reasons, because it seemed slightly easier than actually talking about their feelings. Little did they know that their duel would go down in history, not as a glorious battle between titans, but as the living embodiment of the phrase much ado about nothing. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. Or more accurately, it is a story that will continue in about 15 minutes after we've discussed the fascinating history of medieval foot blisters. The supposed rules of this historic duel were established with all the formality of a drunken tavern bet, which, coincidentally, was exactly how they were decided on the eve of combat. Sir Reginald and Sir Geoffrey had stumbled into the village as least reputable inn known locally, as the tipsy tunic do to its tendency to make patrons lose both their dignity and their clothing, to negotiate terms under the watchful eye of Brother Anselm, a monk whose qualifications as an impartial mediator consisted entirely of owning a rusty set of scales and having once read half of a legal scroll before falling asleep on it. The negotiations began with Reginald slamming a gauntlet onto the ale-stained table, a dramatic gesture undermined by the fact it was actually a gravy-stained oven he'd mistaken for his formal challenge glove. Geoffrey, never one to be outdone in pettiness, responded by producing a list of 17 highly specific demands that included favorable weather conditions and a guarantee that no one would laugh if he tripped What followed was 3 hours of increasingly nonsensical bargaining that somehow resulted in a set of official duel rules that made less sense than the village drunk's explanation. Of white turnips were secretly plotting against the nobility. First and foremost, magic was strictly prohibited, a rule that would have been more impactful if either knight had ever encountered anything more mystical than a suspiciously lucky dice rule. Second, no outside assistance was allowed, a clause that caused both men and squires to immediately start planning how to covertly assist their masters without technically violating the terms. The third and most hotly contested rule involved the definition of victory. Reginald insisted it should be first blood, which Geoffrey protested because he bruised like a peach. Geoffrey countered with last man standing, which Reginald rejected because standing for prolonged periods aggravated his lumbago. They eventually compromised on a 4-part victory condition that included first blood, yield, sunset, or general loss of interest from spectators, whichever came first. The weapon selection was another farce. Reginald's ancestral sword turned out to be purely ceremonial. Its blade had never been sharpened, and the hilt contained a hidden compartment for storing snacks, while Geoffrey's borrowed weapon still had bits of sausage clinging to it from the blacksmith's lunch. Their armor was equally problematic. Reginald's ill-fitting plate mail creaked like haunted house with every movement, and Geoffrey's light armor consisted mainly of a leather jerkin with suspicious holes he claimed were for ventilation, but were clearly just evidence of a moth infestation. When the fateful morning drive, the so-called dueling ground was little more than a muddy pasture usually reserved for the village's least productive cow, its boundaries marked by two suspiciously flexible sticks and a rope that kept falling down. Brother Anselm, now nursing a spectacular hangover, attempted to read the rules aloud but kept losing his place in the scroll, partly due to his throbbing headache, and partly because someone had spilled meat on the crucial section about acceptable targets. The surviving text suggested groin strikes might be allowed, if performed with honor. The assembled crowd of 24 peasants, 3 opportunistic sausage vendors, and Buttercup the pig, who quickly lost interest and wandered off, watched as the knights took their positions, Reginald nearly toppling over from the weight of his impractical armor, Geoffrey forgetting which hand held the sword until his squire whispered urgent corrections. When Brother Anselm finally signaled the duel start by dropping his stopwatch into a puddle. What followed wasn't so much a clash of arms as a tragicomedy of errors. Reginald's first heroic swing sent his own helmet flying into a duck pond. Geoffrey's counterattack missed completely and decapitated a particularly unfortunate cabbage. Their second exchange saw both men stumble simultaneously, their weapons clanging together with all the martial prowess of 2 drunkards trying to open a wine cask in the dock. By the 5th minute, the crowd had begun placing side bets not on who would win, but on whether either combatant would land a single clean blow before noon. The sausage vendors did record business. A traveling minstrel began composing a satirical ballad titled Ode to 2 Fools and a Turnip Patch, and high above, even the sun seemed to peer through the clouds with second-hand embarrassment at this spectacle, which was less a duel and more a public demonstration of why most medieval conflicts were ideally resolved through marriage alliances or mildly threatening letters. Yet, for all its absurdity, this farcical confrontation would indeed be recorded as a proper duel in the annals of history, because when it comes to medieval combat, what matters isn't skill or honor, but simply that enough bored peasants witnessed it while eating sausages. And as our 2 warriors continued their dance of incompetence, Reginald, now hopelessly tangled in his own cape, Geoffrey accidentally parrying an attack from an imaginary opponent, fate, or more accurately, a combination of poor footing, weaker bladders, and the villagers' collective desire to go home before it rained again, would soon intervene to bring this legendary clash to its inevitable, underwhelming conclusion. The so-called duel began with all the martial grace of two elderly tavern patrons attempting to stand up simultaneously after a long night of mead consumption. Sir Reginald's opening gambit, a theoretically impressive overhead strike that would have looked magnificent in a tapestry, was immediately undermined when his over-polished gauntlet slipped from his sword hilt, sending the blade spinning through the air in a perfect arc that ended with it embedded in a nearby cart of cabbages, much to the vendor's dismay. Sir Geoffrey, seizing what he mistakenly believed to be a tactical advantage, attempted a bold lunge that instead became an ungainly stumble forward, his borrowed sword dragging through the mud like a reluctant plough as he fought to maintain his balance. The crowd, which had moments before been buzzing with anticipation, now collectively exhaled in a sigh so profound it momentarily extinguished all nearby torches. What followed was less a display of knightly prowess and more a masterclass in how not to handle edged weapons. Reginald, having retrieved his sword from the unfortunate vegetables now cleaved into what the cabbage seller would later describe as aggressively mediocre coleslaw, adopted what he believed to be an in-guard position, but which in reality made him look like a man who had just discovered his own elbows for the first time. Geoffrey responded by raising his own blade into a guard position so textbook perfect that it might have been impressive had he not immediately forgotten what to do next, resulting in both men standing frozen like particularly unheroic statues while a light drizzle began to soak through their padding. The first actual exchange of blows occurred when Reginald, growing tired of the standoff, attempted a straightforward thrust that Geoffrey somehow managed to parry directly into his own left greave, producing a metallic clang that echoed across the field like a particularly underwhelming church bell. This accidental success emboldened Geoffrey to attempt a riposte maneuver he had heard described in songs, but never actually seen performed, which manifested as a wild arsing swing that missed Reginald completely, but did manage to decapitate a nearby scarecrow, causing one hesitant to remark that it was the most effective thing either of them had done all morning. As the duel progressed, if one could call its slow descent into fast progress, a pattern emerged. Reginald would attempt a basic fencing technique he'd have remembered from his squiring days. Geoffrey would misinterpret it as some advanced stratagem and overreact accordingly, and the resulting chaos would invariably endanger the nearby produce or innocent bystanders. At one point, a particularly enthusiastic parry sent Geoffrey's sword flying into the crowd, where it became lodged between two arguing sausage vendors who promptly began using it as the world's most dangerous butter knife. The retrieval of this weapon necessitated a 5-minute pause, during which both knights sat on the ground sharing a water skin while their squires desperately tried to remember how sword belts worked. The drizzle intensified into proper rain around midday, transforming the battlefield into a quagmire that perfectly mirrored the combatants' deteriorating skills. Reginald's next attack saw him slip dramatically to one knee, an accident he quickly rebranded as a tactical crouch, even as mud seeped through his chainmail. In uncomfortable places, Geoffrey, perhaps inspired by this display, attempted his own dramatic maneuver, spinning slash that might have looked impressive had he not gotten halfway through the rotation before realizing he did not know how to stop, resulting in him careening directly into the increasingly traumatized cabbage cart for the second time that day. By this point, the crowd's initial excitement had given way to a sort of bemused endurance, with spectators passing round wineskins and placing side bets on whether the duel would end in actual combat or simply continue until both parties collapsed from exhaustion. The village priest had begun loudly reciting last rites just in case, though whether this was for the knights or the repeatedly victimized vegetables remained unclear. Even Buttercup the pig, having wandered back onto the field in search of scraps, seemed to regard the proceedings with the weary disdain of a creature that knew it could defeat both combatants in single combat. As the afternoon wore on and the rain showed no signs of relenting, what little pretense of formality remained began to dissolve like the edges of a poorly made parchment in a puddle. Reginald's once pristine tabard now resembled a disrag that had lost the will to live, while Geoffrey Speed vents had transformed into gaping portals that funneled rainwater directly into his view. Nogaments, their attacks grew slow and increasingly half-hearted, until at last they found themselves leaning against each other's shoulders, not in some advanced grappling technique, but because neither could stand upright without assistance. It was at this moment as both knights gasped for breath like landed fish, and the crowd debated whether they should intervene or simply wait for nature to take its course. That destiny finally intervened in the form of the one thing that could truly end this spectacle: sheer collective embarrassment. With a synchronized groan that might have been touching had it not been so pathetic, both combatants slumped to their knees in the mud, their weapons falling from numb fingers as the rain washed away what little remained of their dignity. The duel, if it could ever have been called that, was over. Not with a heroic final clash, not with a dramatic death blow, but with two grown men sitting in a puddle, too tired to continue pretending they knew what they were doing. And thus, history would record this momentous occasion not as a glorious battle, but as the day two knights discovered that heavy armor, poor preparation, and inflated egos make for a very uncomfortable afternoon indeed. But as the spectators dispersed, several of them pocketing loose cabbages as souvenirs, and the sausage vendors counted their profits, one question remained: how exactly does one declare a winner when both participants have lost so thoroughly? The answer, as it turned out, would involve an unexpected twist of fate, is surprisingly literate pig, and what historians would later call the least dignified resolution imaginable. Be an honorable duel into a soggy farce, with Sir Reginald and Sir Geoffrey now resembling less noble knights and more a pair of half-drowned rats that had fallen into a barrel of mud. The crowd's initial excitement had long since evaporated, replaced by the sort of weary resignation usually reserved for particularly bad traveling performers or the annual tax collector's visit. As the two combatants wheezed at each other from their respective puddles, Brother Anselm waddled forward with all the enthusiasm of a man heading to his own execution. His ceremonial robes now so waterlogged they made a squelching noise with every step that sounded suspiciously like a raspberry of cosmic disapproval. Right then, he sighed, looking between the two mud-caked heaps of failed chivalry. I believe we've reached the part where someone admits defeat or dies of shame, whichever comes first. Just as he said this, Buttercup the pig, who had been watching the proceedings with the detached amusement of someone who knows they're the smartest creature present, decided to take matters into her own hooves, waddling over to where Reginald's ceremonial dagger lay discarded in the muck. She picked it up in her teeth with surprising delicacy, though whether this was intentional or simply because she mistook it for a particularly metallic carrot remains debated by historians. In what future bards would dramatically call the swine's justice and contemporary witnesses called the funniest damn thing they'd ever seen. Buttercup's sudden headshake sent the dagger flying in a perfect arc that ended with the point delicately pricking Geoffrey's exposed pinky finger. A single drop of blood welled up, glistening in the rain like nature's own punctuation mark on this absurdity. Brother Anselm stared. The crowd stared. Even the rain seemed to pause momentarily out of sheer disbelief. Well, Anselm said after a silence so profound you could hear a nearby peasant reconsidering his life choices. Technically, that counts as first blood. Geoffrey's indignant squawk could have shattered stained glass. The pig is what decides this. Reginald, who had been quietly trying to remember how to breathe, suddenly perked up with the radiant joy of a man who just realized he didn't have to be the most embarrassing person in this scenario anymore. The victory celebration that followed was less a triumphant feast and more a communal therapy session for everyone who had witnessed the debacle. The planned victory parade consisted of two bored stable boys banging pots together until one of them got distracted by a butterfly. The ceremonial loaf of bread meant to honor the winner was immediately stolen by Buttercup, who consumed it with the dignified air of someone collecting rightful payment for services rendered. As night fell, the two former rivals found themselves sharing a bench outside the tavern, united in their mutual humiliation and the unspoken agreement to never speak of this day again. Geoffrey nursed his ale and his pig-inflicted wound while Reginald picked bits of cabbage from armor crevices he didn't even know he had. "We should probably kill everyone who saw that," Geoffrey muttered, more out of obligation than any real conviction. Reginald nodded solemnly, then immediately winced as the motion dislodged a clump of mud that splattered into his drink, and so history recorded its most anticlimactic duel, not as a lesson in honor nor a demonstration of martial prowess, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of poor planning and allowing livestock within 20 feet of anything remotely important. In the end, the only true victor was Buttercup, who would go on to live a long and happy life, occasionally pausing in her wallowing to gaze knowingly at passers-by as if to say, "Yes, I ended a nightly duel. What have you accomplished today?" The morning after the great pig-decided duel dawned with the sort of quiet embarrassment usually reserved for a tavern brawler's waking up in ditches. Sir Reginald of Blandford found himself staring at the ceiling of his modest chambers, his body protesting in ways he hadn't known possible. Every muscle ached. His armor had left him with what could only be described as a full-body bruise, and somewhere in the night he had apparently developed a personal vendetta against stairs. Down in the courtyard, the remnants of yesterday a spectacle lay scattered like the pieces of a joke no one found funny anymore. A trampled cabbage here, a discarded gauntlet there, and inexplicably one of Geoffrey's boots, which had somehow ended up on the roof of the stables. The village, meanwhile, had already begun the delicate process of pretending nothing unusual had happened, though the occasional burst of laughter from the tavern or a peasant suddenly snorting into their porridge betrayed the truth. This was not a story that would be forgotten. Sir Geoffrey, for his part, had spent the night attempting to drown his sorrows in mead, only to discover that even alcohol couldn't make the memory of being bested by livestock any less humiliating. His squire, a long-suffering youth who had signed up for glory and received only absurdity in return, handed him a note from the local scribe that read, in part, official record of the duel. As requested, have taken the liberty of summarizing the event as a spirited exchange of martial prowess, tragically interrupted by unforeseen circumstances. Also, the pig is demanding payment for services rendered. Geoffrey groaned and seriously considered joining a monastery, but history, as it turns out, does not allow such convenient escapes. Within days, the tale had spread beyond the village, carried by merchants, minstrels, and at least one very smug traveling pig herder who claimed Buttercup as a distant cousin. The story mutated with each retelling. Some versions claimed the pig had been trained in secret by a disgraced fencing master. Others insisted the duel had actually been a complex allegory for the futility of human conflict, a theory Geoffrey loudly denounced while waving a sausage in a scholar's face. The local bard, sensing opportunity, composed a ballad titled The Ballad of the Swine and the Swine-Hearted, which became a surprise hit at taverns, though Reginald paid him handsomely to never perform it within earshot again. The legal ramifications were no less absurd. The original dispute, the one about the turnips, remember those, remained unresolved. because it turned out no one actually cared anymore. The village elders, after a tense meeting that mostly involved avoiding eye contact, declared the matter settled by divine Porcini intervention and promptly moved on to more pressing issues. Like the alarming shortage of decent ale, Geoffrey, in a last-ditch effort to salvage his dignity, challenged Reginald to a rematch. But when Reginald pointed out that Buttercup was technically still the reigning champion, Geoffrey stormed off and took up falconry, only to discover that birds of prey also seemed to judge him silently. As for Buttercup, her life took a turn for the luxurious. The villagers, recognizing a true agent of chaos when they saw one, began leaving offerings of apples and turnips at the edge of her pen. Children whispered that she could predict the weather she couldn't. The blacksmith forged a tiny, utterly decorative helmet for her, which she immediately ate. And when a traveling nobleman offered to buy her for an exorbitant sum, the entire village united in refusal, partly out of newfound pride, and partly because they feared what might happen if she were ever weaponized again, years later. When asked about the duel, Reginald would simply sigh and say, "It was a different time." Geoffrey, on the rare occasions he was sober enough to speak on the matter, insisted that history had misunderstood the events, and that there had been a very good reason for everything, though he could never quite articulate what that reason was. And Brother Anselm, who had since retired to a quiet life of copying manuscripts, would always add one final footnote to the tale. Let this be a lesson to all who read it. Or, failing that, at least a mildly amusing diversion while you wait for your ink to dry. And so, the legend lived on not as a tale of heroism, not as a parable of justice, but as a reminder that sometimes the only thing history guarantees is that someone, somewhere, is going to end up looking ridiculous, preferably near a pig. The story should have ended there with two humiliated knights, a village desperately pretending nothing unusual had happened, and a pig who had somehow become the most respected combatant in living memory. But history, much like Buttercup when she smelled something edible, was not done rooting through this particular turnip patch. In the weeks following the duel, something peculiar happened. People kept talking about it. Not in the hushed reverent tones reserved for great battles, nor even the scandalized whispers used for polity. Cull betrayals, but with the kind of gleeful irreverence usually reserved for the time Uncle Oswald got stuck in the butter churn at the harvest festival. The tale spread from village to village, mutating with each retelling like a game of drunken telephone played by chroniclers with questionable literacy. By the time it reached the next county, versions existed where Buttercup had been wearing full plate armor, where the duel had lasted 3 days and been decided by a riddle contest judged by a particularly wise goat, and most bafflingly where Sir Geoffrey had spontaneously turned into a turnip mid-combatter. Version Geoffrey vehemently denied, though not before several peasants began leaving vegetable offerings outside. His manner, Buttercup, blissfully unaware of her newfound fame, continued her Porcini existence with the quiet dignity of a creature who knows she has already won at life. The villagers, however, had other plans. What began as a few joking offerings of apples at her pen evolved into something resembling a cult. The local blacksmith, sensing opportunity and possibly fearing her wrath, forged a tiny ceremonial helm that fit over her as a gift she promptly ate. Though not before allowing a sketch to be made for a posterity, children left polished river stones at the edge of her stylite devotees at a shrine. The tavern renamed its strongest ale the Pig's Justice, which led to some confusion when travelers asked what crime they were drinking to. Even the nobility, who usually pretended peasants didn't exist, took notice when the Baron's tax collector arrived that autumn. He made a point of pausing at Buttercup's pen to toss her a handful of walnuts before conducting his business just in case. Meanwhile, the human participants fared less gloriously. So Reginald, in a desperate bid to control the narrative, commissioned a tapestry depicting the dueler decision he immediately regretted when the artist, either through malice or honest confusion, rendered the scene with Buttercup 3 times her actual size, hovering ominously over the battlefield like some kind of Porcini deity while the knights cowered at her hooves. The tapestry now hangs in the great hall of Blandford Manor, where guests are politely discouraged from commenting on it after the 3rd time of visiting. Diplomat burst into uncontrollable laughter. Sir Geoffrey, unable to escape his shame, briefly considered joining a monastic order before remembering he didn't like getting up early or being silent. Instead, he took up falconry, only to discover his new hawk seemed to regard him with the same disappointed stare Buttercup had. Mastered, the legal ramifications of the duel proved as absurd as the event itself. The original dispute, the one about the turnips that had somehow started this whole mess, was quietly dropped when everyone realized no one actually cared about vegetables anymore. The village elders, after a tense meeting that mostly involved them taking turns sighing, declared the matter settled by higher powers. They pointedly did not specify whether they meant divine intervention or swine intervention. A traveling scholar attempted to write a treatise on the philosophical implications of the duel, positing that Buttercup represented the futility of human conflict when measured against nature's indifference, a theory Geoffrey disproved by throwing a sausage at him as seasons turned. The legend only grew. A traveling troupe of actors staged a reenactment that somehow involved more interpretive dance than actual swordplay. The local bard's ballad, now titled Ode to the Triumphant Soul, had spawned at least 7 unauthorized sequels, including the controversial Buttercup's Revenge, The Hawk Strikes Back. Merchants sold miniature pewter buttercups as good luck charms, though tests proved they worked just as well as regular pebbles. And in a final twist no one could have predicted, the story crossed borders. Diplomats from a neighboring kingdom referenced it during tense negotiations, suggesting their disputed lands be settled by honorable combat. Though perhaps without livestock this time. Years later, when asked about the duel, the participants gave varying accounts. Reginald claimed it had been a strategic withdrawal from what he never specified. Geoffrey insisted there had been extenuating circumstances. He could not name them. The villagers, when pressed, would just smile and say, "You had to be there," though being there had mostly involved standing in the rain wondering why they bothered. And Buttercup, she lived out her days in luxury, growing pleasantly plump on tribute apples and the occasional stolen hat. Her only regret, perhaps, that she never got the chance to do it all again. For in the end, the duel achieved what few historical events do. It made absolutely no difference to the course of history, changed no laws, toppled no kingdoms. And yet, against all odds, it endured, not as a lesson in honor nor a tale of bravery, but as something far rarer, a story that reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe looks at our grand plans and solemn oaths and responds with the perfect unanswerable logic of a pig with a dagger in its mouth. The passage of time, which has a habit of sanding down history's rough edges into palatable myths, somehow only made the great pig-decided duel grow more absurd in retelling. By the turn of the next century, what had begun as a regional embarrassment metastasized into full-blown folklore, mutating with each retelling like a game of telephone played by drunk monks. In the bustling scriptorium of St. Cuthbert's Abbey, Brother Theodoric, a chronicler with the unenviable task of recording local history, stared at the growing pile of contradictory accounts before him with the expression of a man who deeply regretted taking his vows. There was the version from the village reeve who claimed Buttercup had been divinely inspired the ballad from the travelling minstrel, which inexplicably featured a romantic subplot between the pig and Geoffrey's discarded gauntlet, and, most distressingly, Sir Reginald's own memoir on and other things I definitely had, which devoted 7 parchment pages to describing his armor as shine that morning before conceding tea. H.E. Pig incident may have occurred. Theodoric dipped his quill in ink with the resignation of a man about to commit heresy against historiography. In the year of our Lord 1372, he wrote, "There transpired in Blandford a judicial combat most singular." He paused, crossed that out, a duel of unusual circumstance. Another line through the parchment, finally. In a fit of pique, 2 idiots fought a pig, one let us never speak of this again. His abbot made him rewrite it. Meanwhile, in the secular world, the duel's legacy took on increasingly surreal forms. At the University of Paris, a heated debate erupted between scholars over whether Buttercup's victory represented Aristotelian natural law or just really bad swordsmanship. The theology department suggested it was divine intervention. The law faculty argued it was technically binding. The medical school dissected a pig to find out where the cunning was stored and discovered mostly breakfast in Florence. A young artist's sketch of the triumph of the swine over man, depicting Buttercup in a laurel wreath bestowing wisdom upon cowering knights, was quietly burned by church authorities, though not before several illicit copies circulated among intellectuals who found it disturbingly plausible. Back in Blandford, the village had fully embraced its newfound notoriety. The annual harvest festival now featured a reenactment where the butcher's son, dressed in increasingly elaborate pig costumes, recreated the fateful dagger toss to cheering crowds. Geoffrey's descendants had stopped attending after the 3rd year, when someone added a musical number. The taverness sign, formerly depicting a heraldic lion, had been replaced with a smug-looking sow holding a sword, beneath which read, "Our ale didn't start this, but it'll help you forget." Even the local legal system adapted. Minor disputes were now optionally settled by swine judgment, wherein parties would stand in the pig pen, while Buttercup's great-great-grandpiglets sniffed at their feet. Whichever one she ignored first was declared the loser. It was, everyone agreed, at least as fair as trial by combat. The duel's infiltration into high culture reached its zenith when, at a royal banquet in 1398, a visiting diplomat attempted to flatter King Richard II by comparing his wisdom to the noble Blandford porker, who so deftly settles men's quarrels. The ensuing silence lasted just long enough for 3 separate courtiers to consider throwing themselves from the nearest window. The king, reportedly, laughed so hard he required a new doublet. Yet, for all its notoriety, the duel stubbornly refused to conform to any useful moral. Was it a parable about humility? Then why did Buttercup get a statue before any actual war heroes? A warning against judicial combat. Then why had local duel petitions increased? Now that participants knew the worst possible outcome was mild porcini intervention, even death couldn't quash the story. When Sir Reginald finally passed peacefully in bed after writing 17 drafts of an epitaph that never mentioned the pig, his tombstone was found the next morning with a crude carrot carved at its base. Geoffrey, who outlived his rival just long enough to be annoyed by it, demanded his own burial site be guarded. The night watchman later reported seeing a shadowy figure with a snout lurking near the grave, though this might have been the tavern's new pig's justice ale, which now contained actual pork seasoning. As the years rolled on, the duel became one of those historical oddities that scholars referenced when proving reality has no obligation to be dignified. The Vatican's index of suspiciously improbable events listed it under divine jokes. A Flemish tapestry depicting the scene hung in a ducal palace for decades before anyone noticed the artist had wove. And tiny crowns onto Buttercup's ears. And in a final twist that would have made Geoffrey spit his mead, the story crossed the channel. French chroniclers gleefully recorded it as proof of English barbarity, conveniently ignoring their own nation's rich history of livestock-related embarrassments. Perhaps the last word belongs to Brother Theodoric, who in his final years appended a marginal note to his original chronicle. If some future age reads this and doubts, know that we doubted too. And yet the pig was real, the men were fools, and history, as always, is what survives when dignity does not. Below this, in fainter ink, he added, also, the tavern's pork pies are now suspiciously good. Investigate. The passage of time, which has a habit of either sanctifying or erasing history's more awkward moments, did something truly unusual with the legacy of the pig-decided duel. It turned it into an institutio. N. What began as a single afternoon of porcini intervention in a muddy field became, through some alchemy of human stubbornness and collective amusement, a cultural touchstone that refused to fade into obscurity. By the turn of the next century, the duel had transcended its origins as a local embarrassment and achieved something far more dangerous. It had become legally binding. The first recorded instance of official swine judgment occurred in 1412, when two merchants in a neighboring county found themselves locked in a bitter dispute over shipment of spoiled saffron ore. Possibly a misinterpreted hand gesture the court records are unclear. The local magistrate, a man named Judge Arswin, who had presided over one-to-many cases involving livestock-related property damage, made a ruling that would echo through legal history. Given that neither party appears capable of rational discourse and considering the precedent set by the Blandford arbitration of 1370, to this court hereby orders the matter settled by Porcini. Mediation. The chosen arbiter, a portly surnamed Duchess, was led into the courtroom, where she promptly sat on one merchant's foot and bit the other's purse, thus establishing a perfect metaphor for the judicial system that scholars would analyze for centuries. The losing merchant's appeal, but the pig was biased, was dismissed on the grounds that all pigs are inherently neutral parties, concerned only with truth and apples. News of this revolutionary legal approach spread like wildfire, or more accurately, like a particularly determined rumor in a kingdom with too much time on its hands. Within a decade, swine courts had sprung up across the region, each with their own officiating pig trained, or more often, merely bribed with treats to render judgments. The pig's criteria remained mysterious. Some seemed to favor plaintiffs wearing brighter colors. Others appeared to judge based on who smelled more like breakfast, but their decisions were accepted with surprising equanimity, possibly because the alternative was actual litigation, which everyone knew could drag on for years and involve significantly more Latin. The Church, initially wary of this development, eventually gave its grudging approval after a particularly persuasive abbot pointed out that if God could speak through burning bushes, surely divine wisdom could manifest in a pig's snout. By 1425, the system had become sophisticated enough to require specialized porcini barrister squires trained in the art of presenting cases to livestock, which mainly involved knowing when to scatter feed for emphasis. The most famous of these, a quick-witted clerk named Thomas of Willowbrook, wrote the seminal legal text on the proper bribing of swine, which remained standard courtroom reading until the invention of the gavel. Back in Blandford, Buttercup's descendants lived in porcini opulence. Their sty expanded into a veritable judicial palace, complete with a thatched roof and a dedicated scribe to record their rulings. Which mostly consisted of which nobleman's cloak they chose to nap on. But no one needed to know that. The village became a pilgrimage site for those seeking what became known as swine wisdom, part legal remedy, part tourist attraction, and entirely ridiculous. A thriving market sprung up round the original dueling ground, selling everything from miniature pig figurines for good luck in court to suspicious sausages that claimed to be definitely not related to the sacred lineage. The annual Swine Judgment Festival drew crowds from across the realm, featuring reenactments of the original duel now with musical numbers, a most judicial-looking pig competition, and the increasingly popular Duncan Nobleman booth. Meanwhile, the duel's human participants faded into merciful obscurity, so Reginald's family, after generations of trying to live down the association, eventually embraced it by adding a very small, very discreet pig to their coat of arms, which everyone politely pretended was a boar. Sir Geoffrey S. descendants weren't so lucky his great-grandson S. attempt to revive the duel tradition probably ended with him being bested by a particularly aggressive goose, thus ensuring the Geoffrey name would forever be associated with losing to poultry. As the medieval world marched onward, the duel's legacy became something far greater than its participants could have imagined, not as a cautionary tale about hubris nor as a historical footnote, but as proof that sometimes justice works best when delivered by a disinterested third party with for legs and a healthy appetite. The final word on the matter perhaps belongs to Brother Theodoric, who in his twilight years added one last marginal note to his chronicle. They say history is written by the victors. In this case, it was written by whoever was holding the apples. As the centuries unspooled like so much unraveled parchment, the big decided duel refused to fade into dignified obscurity as most historical embarrassments do. Instead, it metastasized into something far more enduring and infinitely more absurd, a permanent fixture in humanity's collective consciousness, mutating with each retelling like a game of telephone played by drunk historians. By the Renaissance, what had once been a regional farce had blossomed into full-blown cultural mythology, its tendrils creeping into art, literature, and most alarmingly international diplomacy. In 1523, when King Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France met at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, their lavish summit nearly collapsed after a French diplomat casually remarked that the English legal system ran on pig whimsy. This led to a 3-hour debate about judicial livestock that only ended when someone pointed out both nations had, at various points, used poultry in courtroom proceedings. The academic world fared no better. At the University of Bologna, a heated scholarly rift emerged between the porcinists who believed swine judgment represented proto-democratic ideals and the Baconites who argued it proved all governance was ultimately arbitrary. This intellectual feud produced 17 treatises, 3 duels ironically, and 1 disastrous experiment where a philosophy professor attempted to teach logic to a litter of piglets. The results were inconclusive, though the pigs did demonstrate a firm grasp of cause and effect when it came to dinner bells. Meanwhile, in Florence, Machiavelli briefly considered including a chapter about the duel in The Prince before deciding even his cynical worldview couldn't accommodate political advice from barnyard animals. Artistic interpretations grew increasingly unhinged. A Flemish master as oil painting the triumph of swine judgment depicted Buttercup ascending to heaven on a cloud of sausages while angels played lutes shaped like turnips. Shakespeare's lost play The Two Noble Porkers, allegedly written after a particularly liquid tavern bet, was said to feature the line "toink or not toink," though no manuscript survives, likely because anyone who read it died of embarrassment. Even the Sistine Chapel nearly included a pig in its frescoes before Michelangelo reportedly snarled, "I'll paint God reaching for a man's hand, but I won't paint the Almighty reaching for a slop bucket." The scientific revolution brought new scrutiny. Descartes, upon hearing the tale, allegedly muttered "oink. Therefore I am before immediately denying he'd said any such thing." Sir Isaac Newton, after establishing the laws of motion, briefly attempted to calculate the precise trajectory of Buttercup's fateful dagger toss before giving up and inventing calculus instead. The Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions published a paper titled Porcini Jurisprudence, a mathematical model for predicting swine rulings, based on treat dispersion patterns that was widely celebrated until someone noticed the research had been funded by a sausage magnate as industrialization dawned. The duel found new life in popular culture. Victorian moralists recast it as a cautionary fable about the dangers of unchecked animal influence, conveniently ignoring that their own legal system frequently relied on foxhounds. A traveling circus featured the world's most judicial pig, who could supposedly predict the weather and pick marriage partners. Her success rate for both hovered around 50%, which was still better than most astrologers. Mark Twain quipped that the story proved history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and sometimes those rhymes are in Pig Latin. The 20th century, with its peculiar genius for commercializing everything, saw Buttercup's likeness appear on everything from lunchboxes, Porky's judicial picnic set to protest science animal rights. Activists adopted her as an early mascot. A 1936 Broadway musical closed after one performance when the lead actor dressed as a 6-foot-tall singing pig was pelted with vegetables by critics during the Cold War. CIA operatives briefly investigated whether Soviet collective farms were training judicial pigs as propaganda tools before realizing no one could actually train pigs to do anything. In the digital age, the duel achieved its final, perfect form. Meme immortality. Hashtag pig justice trended whenever court rulings went viral. Online arguments were settled with "let's ask the pig" reaction gifs. Wikipedia editors raged over whether to classify swine judgment as legal history or performance art. A tech startup launched an app called Hog Arbitrator that used AI to render pig-based rulings on petty disputes. It was shut down after determining Jeff Bezos should give all his money to a terrier named Mr. Snuffles. And so, against all odds and all laws of historical gravity, what began as two mediocre knights and one disinterested pig became something eternal, not because it was important, but precisely because it wasn't, in a world obsessed with grand narratives and heroic arcs. The pig-decided duel endured as the ultimate counter-argument. Sometimes history isn't made by great men or seismic events, but by a chain of stupid decisions culminating in a farm animal holding all the cards. As the last living descendant of Sir Reginald, now a vegan podcaster, recently observed, the real lesson isn't that pigs can judge us, it's that we've always deserved to be judged by pigs.